de Historia de África en la Universidad de Warwick desde 2013. Ha ocupado diferentes cargos, ha sido profesor de política africana en Oxford, director del British Institute of Eastern Africa, ubicado en Nairobi, director del Center Africa of Studies en la Universidad de Londres. Él obtuvo su doctorado en Trinity College, en Cambridge, y es miembro de la British Academy. Ha tenido diferentes posiciones, es fellow de la Royal Historical Society, y ha sido profesor visitante en Princeton's All Souls College en Oxford, Stellenbosch, Oslo, la Universidad de Australia Occidental. Y su investigación actualmente ha hecho diferentes temas, pero su investigación actual habla sobre el poder y la violencia en los estados y los legados coloniales que esta violencia tuvo en África Oriental, junto con historias ambientales, políticas, de los recursos naturales. Tu obra en realidad es bastante extensa, pero es de las que pude recoger para hacer un poco breve esta introducción. Se encuentra History of the Hanged, Britain Dirty War in Kenya at the Old Empire, publicado en 2005. También publicó The Routledge Handbook of African Politics en 2013, Politics and Violence in Eastern Africa, Resilience and Collapse in Africa, Savannas, en 2017. Y toda esta bibliografía o estas publicaciones han contribuido mucho a los debates globales sobre descolonización, cambio climático, descolonización, contrainsurgencia. Asimismo, ha publicado diversos artículos, sobre todo tiene un ensayo en la English Historical Review de 2018 sobre las mujeres misioneras y silencios coloniales en Kenia. Este artículo reformuló las dimensiones del género, del imperio. Tiene un estudio que se llama Law and History Review sobre los enjuiciamientos por la violación durante la rebelión Mau Mau, y precisamente este trabajo amplió debates sobre esta guerra y la guerra sucia. Entonces, bueno, esto nada más es como una pequeña introducción. En los últimos años se ha dedicado mucho a la historia ambiental, las metodologías digitales, es coautor de estudios sobre gobernanza y conflicto en torno al agua, publicaciones que han salido en el Journal of Environmental and Development Studies, Water International, que hacen un análisis mediante inteligencia artificial y de redes viales históricas de Kenia. Y bueno, el día de hoy va a presentar una investigación que a lo mejor es un tema que para los africanistas se ha estudiado recurrentemente, pero presenta nueva evidencia. Se llama Violence and Dictatorship in Africa, Colonial Legacies in the Making of Idi Amin.
Muchas gracias. A wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. And how lovely to see so many people coming to this talk. I'm very flattered and very, very honored that you're all here. This is my first visit to Mexico. I don't know how much you all know about African history, but we'll try and tell you some more this morning. So I'm going to start by explaining why I'm focusing on this guy, Idi Amin. Can we put up the first slide? Here's a picture of Amin. Let me get this up. Here's Amin at a gathering of African leaders from 1976, by which time he's been in government half a decade. And he's sitting there with other African dictators, because by 1976, there was a kind of African dictators club. So many countries had dictatorships and authoritarian governments. So I'm going to try and explain not why there was so much dictatorship, but why Amin's state in Uganda became so notoriously violent. Why was this particular government the way it was? Because it was unusual. The levels of violence conducted by this government were far greater than in other places, in almost every measure you can think of. So it needs some kind of explanation. And historians have not explained it. So also quite recently, there's been a trend in Uganda for a revisionist view of Amin. Even though it's acknowledged that under Amin's regime, as many as 2 million Ugandans may have been killed by the regime. Even though that fact is known, and that therefore many Ugandans suffered under this regime, there is currently revisionism of Amin going on within Uganda. And writers are beginning to suggest that maybe Amin's period wasn't so bad after all, and that people, despite all of the problems, survived nevertheless. In other words, a history of resilience and of coping has begun to emerge. Now, this history has its place for sure, because those things are certainly important. But that kind of history also leaves those whose families were the victims of this violence and may actually still be quite traumatized by the memory of what happened. It leaves them feeling rather awkward, rather difficult. Where do they put their personal positionality in that story? So in response to this revisionism, I think it's required for historians to restate why that violence matters and why we should try and understand it better than we do. Now, at the moment, forgive and forget appears to be the message in a tone of reconciliation. But to do so, as I say, involves an act of historical erasure. The violence of Amin's Uganda is perhaps no longer the thing we should emphasize, some would say. But there are dangers in this revisionism, dangers that should be especially obvious to us in the age in which we live now, which some people might call a post-truth age. And those dangers were obvious to earlier generations too. The English writer George Orwell most pithily summarized the perils of such revisionism. When he made the quote in one of his books, he said, "The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, and the lie became the truth." And that's a very important phrase to remember, erasure. If you start erasing the details of the past, there is a danger you lose it. And that is what you must guard against. So not everyone is prepared to accept such a passive attitude towards Amin, least of all those Ugandan citizens who have been praised for their stoicism and forbearance. Violence has an afterlife for those who experience it. Forgiveness can be difficult, and forgetting for some is impossible. So, in my opinion, revisionism needs to be challenged, lest the lie becomes the truth. So, before I dive into what went on in Amin's Uganda, let's give you a kind of contextual sense of what African history at this period is about and what's going on, so you can place Amin in a context. So next slide, Christian, thank you. So, sorry, yeah. So the first thing to say is that the post-colonial state in Africa, which dates from, say, circa 1960, is actually a very weak kind of state. And many states between 1960 and the 1970s would be overtaken by authoritarianism, by military governments, by one-party rulers. The writer Frederick Cooper, the American historian, has described Africa's states as being like gatekeeper states, by which he means that the governments controlled access to resources and very much scrutinized who would be rewarded. And if you were on the government team, you got reward, you're allowed through the gate, you get what you want. If you're not on the government team, you get nothing. So these become very divisive states. Also, at the time of Africa's independence, there were very high expectations of what that independence would bring. So there was a great anticipation of the freedoms and the economic benefits that would accrue. Now, those post-colonial states invariably proved unable to fulfill those high expectations. So even by the end of the 1960s, there was great dissent within many African countries about the failures of national governments to deliver on those expectations. Now, part of that failure had been linked to weak governing institutions, especially the legislatures. And all over Africa, African countries basically inherited colonial systems of government, often unchanged. So they carried all of the weaknesses of those systems of government. And most important of all, colonial government in Africa was itself authoritarian. So it provided the weapons and the means by which independent governments could adopt the same behavior. So I would even suggest to you that African independent governments, despite being profoundly nationalist and having a strong nationalist and patriotic rhetoric, were often behaving in very colonial ways. And their authoritarianism was part of that. Now, this could be seen most clearly in those who came to power through military coups. Coups in Africa became very common between 1961 and 1980. There were more than 200 attempted coups in Africa over that period. Some countries had more than a dozen different coups. Many countries had 2 or 3, was quite common. Coup leaders who came to power often claimed to be acting on behalf of the people. So they claimed to be populists. They claimed that they were bringing back good governance. They claimed to be overthrowing corrupt politicians. In very few cases did those claims prove to be justified. And Amin is a good example of this. He comes to power by a military coup. He overthrows an elected legitimate government. And when he comes to power, people line the streets cheering. He is welcomed. He is heralded as a savior of the nation. And he makes statements about restoring ethics and values to Ugandan people. So he very much fits this pattern. Also, the militaries, and Amin is again a good example of this, often portrayed themselves as disciplined institutions. They said the politicians were ill-disciplined. They did not know how to behave. But soldiers had discipline. Therefore, soldiers would bring order to the state. And they would bring about also modernization. Now, maybe to some extent, modernization was achieved by some of these governments. But at what cost? We'll come back to. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So let's think now about the kinds of militaries you got in Africa, and perhaps especially about the kind of military that Amin was head of. In both French and British Africa, militaries had been part of the colonial state's form of coercive rule. Those militaries were retained after independence and rebadged, given a new name and a new meaning. But they were basically the same people. And the officers of those militaries were very rapidly, the African officers were very rapidly promoted prior to independence in order to replace the Europeans who were leaving. So officers like Amin would achieve 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 promotions in 1 or 2 years in order to get them from the rank of sergeant to senior commander very rapidly. So all over the continent, you saw militaries that had very proud African officers who were very poorly trained and very inexperienced, yet had tremendous authority and command. And Amin is typical of this. Amin had been involved with groups of soldiers who had protested at the end of colonialism about their poor pay and the slow pace of Africanization, of them being promoted. They'd encouraged an attitude whereby they would be more rapidly rewarded. Africa's 3 East African territories, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, all became independent between 1960 and December 63. And in January 1964, all 3 experienced military mutinies. So militaries tried to take over in all 3 countries over the space of 3 weeks. So these militaries were quite volatile and quite aggressive in asserting their own value to the state. And remember that these army officers after independence, they are then the military of the nationalist government who they've just spent the previous 5 years beating up and putting in prison. So that transformation was uncomfortable. And the military overall, over many African countries, and especially in the case of Uganda, did not respect the politicians they were then serving. They'd seen those politicians as the enemy, and they struggled to reconcile that once independence had come. And as Paul Nugent, I quote Paul Nugent here, one of the historians who's written about this, within a few years of independence, it was apparent that many African rulers had created a monster. That monster was the military, which they could not adequately feed or control. In other words, politicians tried to combat this by increasing pay, improving conditions, rewarding African military officers with promotions, but all the monster wanted was more and more and more. And Uganda was a classic example of this, but other countries were not so dissimilar. Politicians, African politicians at the time, believed that they could interfere in military affairs. So they were constantly trying to direct the army in what it did. The soldiers resented this deeply, and they very much pushed back against the politician. There are also lots of divisions within the military. We'll come to those in a few moments in more detail. Ethnic divisions, personal rivalry, factionalisms of different battalions. And those were to some extent fostered by the way that colonialism organized the military. And those weaknesses were continued into independence. Next slide, please, Christian. Thank you. I also need to stress that these things I'm describing are being conducted in an economic climate that is verging on crisis. So by around the mid-60s, 65, 66, the economies of the African countries in East Africa in particular are struggling. They've done reasonably well before that, but they then begin to lose the momentum they've had, and we begin to see that they are struggling to maintain export incomes. Most of them are cash crop economies, sometimes only exporting 2 or 3 different commodities, and they are very vulnerable to shifts in world prices. And there's nothing much they can do about this. In 1973, they will be very badly hit by the OPEC crisis, the oil petroleum producing countries crisis, and they will find themselves shifting into a very strongly negative balance of payments deficit. And Uganda was one of the worst affected by the OPEC crisis, because Uganda became the country with the most expensive fuel in the world as a consequence. And remember that fuel is not just the gasoline you put in your car, it's also the oil you use for your lighting for your lamps. It covers everything. So a very high cost of fuel is very damaging to the public at large. So you can't do your homework at night because you have no light, because you can't afford the oil for your lamp. And there is no electricity by this time. There is no national grid. So high fuel prices have a really significant impact in countries such as this. So they're vulnerable to fluctuation in global economies, and they don't have many alternatives with which to benefit. So Amin comes to power at the end of the 1960s in his coup, and over the 70s, he's experiencing this crisis of the post-colonial economy. Yeah? So all of these things, it's kind of like a perfect storm of problems. And I think you can see quite easily how this opens up opportunities for the kind of leadership that Amin was able to give. Okay, so that's, next slide, please. That's my context. And everything I've said just then applies very much to Amin, but could apply to many other African states around the same period. So now I'm going to dive into Amin and into the situation in Uganda and say something about how that looked. So some historians have suggested that Africa has a lot of military government because that's what Africans like. This is nonsensical. There is no evidence to support this at all. But it's quite fashionable, especially among right-wing writers in Europe, to argue such things. In fact, most African communities in East Africa fear the military. And they feared the military from colonial times. If soldiers came, you got your children indoors very quickly. You hid things away. You were aware that soldiers, even colonial soldiers, were pariahs. They were parasites. They would take things from you. You did not see them as your protectors. You saw them as a threat. And that is how they were seen even after independence. So the idea that the military somehow are accepted in Africa, do not believe that for one moment. It is not true. It's a European myth. So how then do we account for all of this? How do we account for this military dependence that appears to come about in the 60s and 70s? Well, I think we need to understand the way in which the weakness of these African states opened the door to military participation. The famous East African political scientist Ali Mazrui has written about this by describing the Ugandan army and other armies in the region as being like a military aristocracy. He says they were allowed to engage in government with government in a way that would never have been accepted in a Western democracy or anywhere else for that matter. And that by being brought into government in that way, the politicians tied a noose around their own necks. They made themselves vulnerable. And this is exactly what happens in Uganda. Amin is promoted to be head of the military. He is brought into the cabinet. He is permitted to participate in political decisions. So naturally, he thinks he's part of that system. So when he comes to take power in a coup, he believes that what he is doing is legitimate. He genuinely believes that. He thinks he has a right to do this because he is part of this political state. So let's look at the background to some of that and think about why that might have been the case. So Amin was recruited into the British Army in the late 1940s. He served in a regiment known as the King's African Rifles, very British sounding name, King's African Rifles. And this regiment is very typical of British colonialism. So the regiment is made up of African rank and file soldiers with European officers. And European officers are brought in from other British regiments and they command the battalions. But all the soldiers who do the work and the fighting, they are all African. There is a color bar here. This is a very racist system. So the Africans in this military are only allowed to rise to the rank of sergeant. They cannot go higher. In fact, Amin gets, there's a special rank they give that Amin gets, which is called Effendi, which is like a senior sergeant. But that's as high as any African is allowed to get. So this is a racially defined system. The military also are given a great deal of freedom in what they do. So what does a colonial army do in its own colony? Well, it mostly polices rebellion or protest or dissent. So it's used to dealing with people who are opposing the state. That's what it does. So this is not an army that fights battles in other countries. This is an army that polices its own people. Now, in the case of East Africa, many parts of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda were run entirely by the military. So northern Uganda, northern Kenya, throughout the colonial period, are under military rule. So they don't have proper government. The southern parts of the colonies have proper government. but the northern parts are considered remote and, to be frank, primitive. So the military are allowed to rule those areas, and they impose military law. And they can do pretty much what they like. So up until the 1930s, the military in these areas still hold summary trials and execute people on the spot with firing squads. No need for a judge, no need for a jury. So this is a very, even within colonial context, this is an unusual type of colonial control. And that is what Amin comes into, that kind of environment where you expect soldiers to be able to do these things without any real responsibility. So they have impunity. So Amin joins what's called the 4th King's African Rifles Regiment. That's the Ugandan regiment. He rises to the rank of sergeant. He's involved mostly in activities in these northern areas where he's controlling pastoralist groups, cattle keeping groups, who are often semi-nomadic or nomadic. These people, Amin and his fellow soldiers view as primitive and backward, and they treat them accordingly. So they don't give them rights. They don't think they have any real values. This is a very uneven system. So up until the 1953, Amin serves mostly in Uganda, but towards the end of 1952, a rebellion breaks out in Kenya called the Mau Mau Rebellion, and Amin's battalion, the 4th King's African Rifles, is sent into Kenya to deal with the Mau Mau Rebellion. So Amin then spends 3 years in Kenya fighting against Mau Mau. Now, there are many accounts of Amin's role in this war. The Mau Mau Rebellion was a particularly unpleasant insurgency, and the British fought it with a very unpleasant counterinsurgency. So many very unpleasant things happened, including the routine torture of prisoners, the killing of prisoners without trial, the mistreatment of individual citizens and villagers as part of the campaigns. Amin has been accused of being involved in all of those things, and there are many stories that circulate about Amin's activities as a soldier in Kenya in the 50s. None of these stories, though, are corroborated. We don't actually know if any of them are really true. Some of them strike me as being maybe a bit mythologized, maybe a bit apocryphal, because certainly all of these African soldiers in this war were involved in unpleasant things. But maybe Amin was no different than anyone else in that context. But it does show us that even quite close, so this is less than a decade before Uganda will become independent. In that context, this military is behaving in a way that most states and governments would not consider acceptable. And that's, for Amin, the norm. Now, in this context, Amin then completes the Mau Mau Rebellion. It's over, the fighting's over by around 1956. He goes back to service in Uganda, and he is sometimes involved in what are called punitive expeditions. It's a lovely English phrase, this, a punitive expedition. What they mean is a punishment of a local community by the military. So they're sent into areas perhaps where there's been cattle rustling, or there's maybe been an attack by one village on another, and the army is sent in to discipline the local population. That's the kind of work Amin is doing. Now, an interesting aspect of this is that just before Uganda's about to become independent in 1962, the Ugandan military is asked by their Kenyan neighbors to assist in the pacification of the northwestern part of Kenya, where there's a group known as the Turkana living. And the Turkana have been raiding some of their neighbors to steal cattle. And they've been going into Uganda, into southern Sudan, and crossing the borders. So Amin is sent with his battalion into Turkana for the expedition against them. Now, this becomes of interest to us because in that expedition, Amin's platoon is involved in a quite horrific atrocity in which they arrest the members of a village, they interrogate them, it is alleged but not proven that they molest the women. They then begin torturing the men in order to get information from them. This goes on over several days and is done in a particularly, I don't need to give you the details, but it's done in a particularly unpleasant manner. The result is that 7 of these villagers die of these tortures, and 30 to 40 others are seriously injured. It's not clear what Amin was the commander who oversaw this. It's not clear what Amin was trying to achieve. And it's not clear whether he fully understood the implications of this. But of course, violence on this scale is not a secret. And very quickly, villagers from this area reported what had happened back to others. And the officials in Kenya began investigating it. Very quickly, they realized the truth of what was being said, and they arrested Amin. So here's the British government in Kenya arresting the senior African officer of the British military from Uganda, who is in Kenya doing work for the Kenyan government. So this is a complicated situation. They decide that the offenses that have been committed are so serious that they cannot be ignored. So they put Amin before a courts-martial. And he's put on trial. There's a military court, but if he's found guilty, he will hang. So this is very serious. So the courts-martial takes place, and in fact, in the archives in the UK, we have the full record of everything that happened in that courts-martial. Interestingly, of the 30 books written about Amin, only 1 historian has bothered to look at this file about the courts-martial. I find this difficult to understand, but only 1 historian has looked at this. Because it's a fascinating account, because Amin comes into court and gives his own version of why he did this and what he thinks was going on. And what he betrays is that to him, what's the problem? Why are you asking me this question? You told us to come in and discipline these people. We've done what you told us to do. Why are you bothering me with this? That's his attitude. Yeah? So the court finds him guilty. But the verdict's reported back to the governor in Nairobi in Kenya, and he quickly realizes this is a problem because Uganda will become independent in the next 2 months. So can its neighboring country, Kenya, hang its chief military officer on a gallows in the week before the independence? He decides that's not a good look. So essentially, he sends Amin back to Uganda and says that the incoming Ugandan government should decide how to handle this. In English, we have a phrase of this called passing the parcel, giving the problem to someone else. So Amin is spared, because when he goes back to Uganda, the incoming government of Milton Obote decides to pardon him. So they basically endorse his version of events. He was doing what he was told to do, and they pardon him, and they then promote him. So his behavior is condoned and endorsed and rewarded. Now, Obote will come to regret this, because Obote is the president who's overthrown in Amin's coup. He will be removed by Amin less than a decade later, 7 years later. So I think that episode is very revealing for understanding the attitudes of Amin to violence. And I'm happy in the Q&A to answer more questions on that event and its significance, and to put it in a broader context. I've got lots more information on it. But let me move on from that and then think about what happens to Amin once he's back in Uganda in the 60s Uganda is now independent, and he is the senior military officer in the Ugandan army. As I mentioned, he is brought into politics. He becomes part of political decision-making, and Milton Obote comes to rely upon him for the army's support. Obote rewards the army with increased salaries and with increased professionalization, as he calls it. In other words, they arm the army better, they buy weapons from other countries, they give them military training, and especially between 1962 and 1965, a whole range of Ugandan junior officers are sent to Britain for training. And they go to the British training centers in Sandhurst and Aldershot, and they receive quite high quality military training. All of those people come back and then serve immediately under Amin and become a kind of cohort of officers that Amin relies upon. And he takes charge of their careers. Now, this is important because once Amin is himself in power and is a dictator, it's these officers who will conduct his violence. He places these officers in charge of the various units he creates to do the violence work. These professionally trained soldiers will be the ones who do this. Not the untrained, ill-disciplined ones, but the properly trained soldiers. In other words, he's creating a cohort of violence workers who will carry out these acts on his behalf. So he's nurturing these. And he's nurturing them in the tradition of the things the King's African Rifles had done before. So Uganda's violence, as it will come in the 1970s, is not just about Amin and his character. It's about a regime that he constructs around himself, that other people participate in. Dictatorships are never just one person. They require a regime around them to make them work. So one or two other things to say about this. Firstly, when Amin comes to power in his coup, it's often been suggested that the British helped to organize the coup and that they knew about it, because by then they decided that Milton Obote was dangerous because he was too left-wing and they thought potentially he had communist leanings. That's true, but there's no evidence that the British were behind the coup. But there is evidence that the Israelis were, that they knew about it, that they supported Amin. At the time, they were trying to garner influence with African states, and they clearly worked with Amin. And one of the telling archive files on this is that just after the coup, the British official in Kampala admits to his officers in London that to find out what was going on, he had to go to the Israeli embassy and ask them, because he didn't know, but the Israelis did. So there are other powers involved in this story, but it's not quite as you may think it would be. The British, in response to Amin's coup, are first a little bit worried. They know about his record, of course, they're aware of it. But they take the view they think he's a man they can work with. And that's a phrase they keep using, we'll work with him. And it's very interesting here because, again, things are not, they don't turn out quite as you think they might. So the British Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, they are very keen to work with Amin because in the context of the Cold War, they see him as being strategically very important. So they want to do business with him. Our Ministry of Defense, our military, takes exactly the opposite view. They say from the beginning, this man is a tyrant and a dangerous dictator. We should have nothing to do with him. And they send a military attaché to Kampala who they instruct to report very widely on the things Amin is doing. So what we find is in the first 3 or 4 years of Amin's government, we get very detailed reports from this military attaché about the things Amin is doing. And he describes, for example, how Amin is forming what he calls these hit squads of violence workers who are going to target opponents and assassinate them. Now, there are at least 4 different groups of this kind that Amin creates, all run by the officers that have been trained in Britain and all put into positions in Uganda to carry out this work. So we know about this. It's not a secret. This is reported in the reports that are coming back to London. It's even reported in press coverage. It's well known what is going on. Yet the British Foreign Office continues to say, oh, no, we must deal with this man. We don't need to worry about the violence. There are more important things than the violence. So there is a constant struggle going on. And at one point, the Ugandans say they want to buy arms from Britain. Amin wants Britain to sell them weapons. So he contacts Britain to ask about this. And a meeting is held in London to decide whether Britain should sell arms to Uganda or not. And at this moment, Britain has a Labour government, a left-wing leaning government. So there is some debate about this. And in this meeting, the military representative argues against selling weapons to Amin. He says, you do not know what this man will do with them. We could be giving weapons to someone who very soon will be an enemy. So don't do this. The Foreign Office argue the opposite way and are so concerned about the military comments that they write to the minister responsible for the military ministry and ask for the man to be dismissed and removed. So very radically different approaches to this problem. Now, the last key point I want to make is that Amin's violence from 1970 onwards, it escalates quite dramatically from 1970 through to about 1974, 75. He sets up the groups I've described to target killings against opponents. These groups, though, are not directed by Amin. So there's no evidence that Amin is saying, I want you to kill him and him and him. What he's doing rather is saying to these groups, you're responsible for discipline and the behavior of people in this area over here. Deal with it. He then lets those officers decide what they will do and who they will do it to. So the violence that goes on has a rather local feel to it and an intimate feel to it. Often the people who are the victims of this violence are aware of who their assailants are. They know them. They're from the same area. So Amin is, as it were, devolving this violent behavior to these other officers who are carrying it out. Hence, it takes on this sometimes it looks like a vendetta. It looks like it's a tit-for-tat war between different groups because of this very intimate character it has. And I genuinely believe that Amin probably was unaware of many of the murders, and I don't think he bothered to count. He wasn't interested. So long as those areas were kept disciplined and quiet and in order, it wasn't his concern who was being killed. And certainly that's the impression you get. Now, when I was reading through the files on this, I was very much reminded of work on Latin America, work on violence workers, and especially the work of Martha Huggins and Mika Haritos Baturos on violence workers. And they've written about Brazil especially, but other countries also, where they point out that there are similar patterns of the recruitment of groups who act as violence workers for the state and carry out the state's actions. And they also point out that these groups often become very autonomous and do things on their own account without really having to refer back. So it strikes me that these are very similar. And I've tried to argue in some of my work that Uganda has a very similar pattern of violence to these Latin American cases. And I'd be interested in questions to hear whether you think that might be true or not. It certainly caused the Africanists who I tell this to, they're not too happy with that. But let's see how it goes. But I do think there are some parallels that are quite interesting. And I've tried in my work to get the term violence worker into the discourse, because these people in Uganda who are carrying this out are being trained in violence for the state. They're not being employed to do anything else. And their neighbors know that. They come home in the evenings and their neighbors know where they've been. So it's not a secret that you're a violence worker. And people will describe them in this way, even now. Oh, he was a violence worker for that group or this group. So the idea of violence work being a category, I think is quite important. And in the work on Africa, people haven't really embraced that idea. And I think maybe they should. They don't like to embrace it, though, because it implies a complicity that is quite deep and quite intense. And if you're trying to be revisionist and look for reconciliation, that's a problem. Because it suggests that that complicity needs to be addressed first before you can deal with the reconciliation. And that is why some of this work is so controversial and so difficult. So a final point, I'm a bit of a fan of, I'm afraid of Jacques Derrida. I know he's an acquired taste. Not everyone likes Derrida. But Derrida wrote a very interesting book a few years ago called Archive Fever, which of course as a historian, I'm attracted by the title. But it also, I think, has other important aspects for this kind of study. Archive Fever dwells on the instability and fragility of the remembered past. And Derrida argues that memory and remembrance are like ghosts. They're spoken and they're silent. They can be revealed, they can be hidden. And it can be quite difficult to maintain them and sustain them. In other words, this kind of remembered past is immensely fragile. Yeah. So he also focuses, though, on the technology of the archive. He says that one way in which that fragility is overcome is that new forms of archive technology become available and you're able to remember in new ways. And this has great importance for Amin, because quite recently we've discovered in Uganda an immense photographic archive that was attached to Amin's personal office. And this archive is of photographs that were taken by Amin's personal photography team. And there are, I think, nearly 5,000 photographs in this collection. And it includes some photographs that are very violent. So it includes some photographs of violent scenes, either just before or just after violence has been perpetrated. It includes lots of images and scenes of Amin himself lecturing people before and after violent acts. So this is a very powerful collection of photographs. And of course, what it is, I would suggest this is Derrida's archive fever. This is a new technology that allows us to re-examine Amin's violence with a new set of archive sources that maybe allows us to say different things than we could say before. And I was very struck by my colleague Richard Vokes, who's an anthropologist who I work with on this, who showed some of these photographs to a family that he has had a long association with, who were the victims of a very, very serious act of violence. They had never before talked about that violent act to him until they saw these photographs. And what Richard reports is that they then, at the time they were showing the photographs, they said very little. But he said their audible sounds and body language was what told you. Oh, just their reaction. How you react to what you see. And after seeing those photographs, members of that family then over the next few days, one by one came and told him their remembrance of that event. So these kinds of archives are like triggers. You know, they trigger the memory that allows you to recapture the history. And that is how you avoid Orwell's erasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Vamos a tomar algunas preguntas, las pueden hacer en español o en inglés. De hecho, David entiende bastante bien el español, pero de todos modos, si no, las puedo yo traducir.
Good morning. First, I wanted to thank you for the talk. It was really interesting, and I'm glad we get to know more about this subject because, well, normally I guess it's because of the context, but this type of history from other continents is not known to us unless it's the European context, of course, because history is Eurocentered. So, well, yeah, my main question was, what do you think? You just told us that the colonies were longer than the ones in Latin America. So I wanted to ask you, like, what other reason besides the amount of time the colonies existed is there for like the underdevelopment of commerce, of the knowledge that is spread around the world about it? Because honestly, personally, this is the first time I've heard about the history of Uganda, especially, but of any country in Africa, really. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very honest, sincere question. Thank you. The length of colonial time, though, be careful, because although British colonialism in Africa comes later, it's not longer than your experience in Latin America. So the British were in East Africa from the 1890s only until the early 1960s. So I've written about this. I call it the colonial moment. It's not very long at all. It's quite short. And what I think is remarkable is that despite it being so short, it has such an immense impact. And that is what interests me about it. So the longevity doesn't seem to be a really important factor. It's the intensity of what happens under that period that matters most of all. But I think the spirit of your question about, okay, so what is it that makes this the way it is? Well, yes, of course, all the things that you could say about underdevelopment in Latin America would apply in Africa too. And in fact, all the literature that I'm sure all you guys have studied about underdevelopment debates here, they've all been applied to Africa in the same way. And in the 1970s and 1980s, the same very prominent Marxian literature was defining how we studied Africa's history. So when I was a student back then, I know I don't look that old, but when I was a student back then in the 1970s, that was exactly what we were studying. And we were comparing it with Latin America. We were encouraged to do that. Now, I don't think the comparison always worked for lots of reasons. But seeing some similarities in some of the processes, I think was quite helpful. And I'm interested that that's how you approached the question to me, that, okay, so this is interesting because bits of this seem familiar, even if other bits seem different. But I don't think you should fall in the trap of thinking it's the same. It's not the same, but there are things you can draw from it, I think, that could be very instructive. And I think, for example, that the ways in which militaries relate to state and political power, there are some lessons there, I think, that are comparisons and can be quite useful. And I think the ways in which militaries do have a heritage, and those who operate in militaries do see themselves as being part of a culture. And I mentioned the political scientist Ali Mazrui. He's written at great length on both the military aristocracy in East Africa, but also what he calls the warrior culture. And he argues that Amin comes from a particular area where there is a warrior culture. And that he says a lot of Amin's behavior is actually culturally defined by his own background. I think that may be going too far, but I'm giving that example to show that there are others who work on this who would go further than I would in explaining it. So great question. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I have a question regarding the act committed by Amin's army during the time in Kenya.
Yeah.
When he was prosecuted and I suppose court-martialed, was one of his official charges sexual assault against the women in Kenya? Because you mentioned there were some allegations, and by the nature of how the crimes were reported, it perhaps
Yeah.
They stayed as allegations, but my question is, was he officially prosecuted for those charges, even if it was just indirectly committed by him by just allowing the soldiers to commit sexual assault?
Fabulous question. You can come and join my class anytime you like. Great question. Because, and why it's a great question is that I've written on sexual assaults in East Africa during the 50s. And it's a subject dear to my heart. So the sexual assaults are not even mentioned in the courts martial because it's all too difficult. Yeah, it's too difficult. They can get him on other charges. They don't need that. And they prefer not to go down that road. And that happens again and again and again. So in the Mau Mau Rebellion, rape is categorically used as a weapon of war, but it rarely appears in the courtroom or on the charge sheet, even when it is described as being part of what happened. And that's the case here too. So I suspect you may have thought that, because I think that's very common in other contexts too. Sexual crimes are repressed if other crimes can be used for the prosecution instead. And often they find it difficult. But you should also realize that in the 1950s in Kenya, when Amin was in Kenya, the Kikuyu people who were the victims of that rebellion, they systematically tried to report rapes in order to publicize they were happening. And this meant that more rapes were prosecuted between 1954 and 1956 in Kenya than in the UK. Yeah, ironic, isn't it? But that came about because of a deliberate campaign by the rebels to identify rape as a crime. Yeah? And all the usual things around that you could guess happened. People denied it and pretended it wasn't happening, but the cases came nonetheless. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Good morning. You said something really important to me, which is that remembrance is like the key to avoid these episodes from ever happening again. But how can we avoid, like you just mentioned in one of your answers, that there's like a cultural war?
Yeah.
So how can we avoid, when we approach to these events in a respectful way, and how can we ensure that we approach these events in a respectful way and with remembrance, not in a like some like morbid and just how can we avoid that someone admires a character like Amin?
Yeah, there's always a danger of cultural essentialism as well. And also there's a danger of the pornography of violence becoming part of the problem. Now, I'm very well aware that not everyone shares my view that remembrance is better than forgetting. And I will tell you, when I began to do my own work on the Mau Mau Rebellion, I told a very dear old colleague of mine in Kenya, Professor Godfrey Muriuki, that I was going to do this work and that I would be revealing a lot of things that had happened that people were not really talking about. And I told Godfrey this. We were sitting on his veranda drinking a whiskey in the evening, and he said, he long pause. He then said, "David, why are you pulling the scab from the wound?" And that is your question, I think. And I totally respect that. That others may think that by pulling the scab from the wound, you are making things worse. But I think my experience of looking at a variety of different conflicts is that I feel the opposite. I think that unless you allow those who were traumatized and affected by this, unless you allow them to have their kind of reconciliation, and that means acknowledging what happened. If you don't acknowledge first, you will never really have reconciliation. You will never really have forgiveness. So I argue quite strongly you have to find some kind of acknowledgement. Now, there are many ways of doing that. And I do not for 1 minute think we should be prosecuting everyone and chasing these people. But I do think we need acknowledgement, and then we can move towards something more meaningful. I hope that answers your question.
Dr. Anderson, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I have this question. You said that the UK government had some trouble with its relationship with Amin.
Yeah.
Some of them agreed to sell him weapons, and some others were in complete opposite, right, to it. To me, that sounds like lobby or like interest groups, right? These events are relatively recent. They happened in the 60s. So maybe some of these tendencies are still happening. That's my question.
Yeah.
Could it be that there are still interest groups that can take this sort of opportunities of failed states or military governed states? Because I mean, we still have these violence workers, even if it's not recognized publicly. We know there are black ops and such types of soldiers. Exactly. So do you think there are still these like interest groups, intelligence agencies still looking out for opportunities where to put their feet on?
I don't only think there are, I know there are. So I'm sure you're correct, and I fully understand the spirit of your question. Even in the UK, even today, we are having a debate about who we sell weapons to. And at the moment, that debate's about Israel. And that debate is very similar to the debate about Uganda in 1973. So you're quite right. These things maintain. And I do understand and accept that the kinds of groups I'm describing could be found in many places today, doing similar things with similar kinds of agency. But for me, that makes the history even more important to understand, because sometimes through the history, you can understand the present better. It's easier sometimes with the detachment of the past to examine what happened then, and therefore to see the present in maybe a brighter light and maybe more clearly. That is what I try to do. It's not always easy, it doesn't always work, but I think you're right to make the connection. I think the past and the present are linked.
And should we here in Latin America pay more attention to such possibility?
That's not for me to say.
Right.
You guys are here, not me. So you have to make your mind up on that. But I tend to feel that, well, let me put it another way. I've not come across any case where I feel that burying the past is a good idea. I mean, maybe you can show me a case, but I've not seen it yet. So I think, yeah, you have to face up to it.
Thank you.
Very tough.
Well, first off, thank you very much. That's very, very interesting. I wanted to ask, what is behind the current historical revisionism that we are seeing so much? And what is the point of whitewashing the crimes of these dictatorships? Why?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good question too. So the current revisionism began about 4 or 5 years ago, and it emerged out of the evangelical right-wing churches in Uganda, who some of the preachers in those churches were advocating reconciliation and were trying to bring together potential members of their congregations who they viewed as being opposed to one another because of their past. So this is a spiritually led, initially, church-based movement to try and invoke reconciliation. It then very quickly became popularized in 1 or 2 local books, pamphlets, written by local Ugandan historians, arguing for the same thing. And from what I can work out, the historians who wrote these pamphlets were also members of these evangelical churches. So there's a connection. Since then, though, it's taken on a different pace. And professional historians have picked it up and begun to present it as revisionism. And some of these are Ugandans, some are people from outside of Uganda. The most famous of them is a guy called Derek Peterson, who's a very well-known American historian, who's just produced a book that is very much a revisionist history. And Peterson would say that he's not trying to hide the violence, but he's trying to make people understand there is a different kind of social history that can be looked at. And I fully accept that. But I think there are some dangers in writing about the 70s in Uganda without mentioning the violence. I think that certainly for those who have trauma and have concerns about what happened, that's not really acceptable. But Peterson and others take a different view. That's how they put it forward. Yeah.
Thank you for giving us this conference. And I'm a bit curious to ask about how you told us how Amin basically inherited the pre-existing colonial structures and adapted them into his dictatorship. But I want to know how Uganda as a whole has done after he left power. If these colonial structures that later became the structures of his dictatorship still last, or if they were toppled down completely.
So it's a great question. Thank you. So what happens is Amin is overthrown in 1978, 77 to 79, but there's a war, and essentially the neighboring country Tanzania invades Uganda. And in invading Uganda, they support guerrilla forces led by Yoweri Museveni, among others. And they overthrow the Amin government. There are then a series of interregnum governments, including one where Obote comes back. But by 1986, 87, they form a new government under Museveni, and that government completely transforms Uganda's political life. So all those colonial heritage issues are removed. The system of government is dramatically altered in many respects, not every respect, many respects, and the way in which it's conducted is altered. So Uganda finally gets rid of that colonial legacy and removes it, but it takes a kind of revolution and a decade of warfare for that to happen.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for coming. I really appreciate that you took the time and the effort to come here in person to talk to us. And I would like to ask two things. First, to what extent do you consider the sort of apathy presented by foreign governments towards Amin's violence helped him or facilitated him to continue perpetrating that violence? And secondly, whether you think or you are concerned that the rise of revisionism and reactionaries in the developed world can facilitate this type of violence from arising again in the near future?
Thank you very much indeed. These are great questions, making me think. So the apathy towards the violence at the time is always contested, yeah? So let me give you another example. So the British government are debating whether to sell arms to Amin. But the foreign secretary under the Labour government is a man called David Owen. And David Owen, I happen to know him personally because he went to school with a friend of mine, and I've got to know him. And David has shown me documents and shared with me his experience. And he is very determined to tell you that when he was foreign secretary, he asked the British Defense Ministry to assassinate Amin. And he tried to issue this as a ministerial order. He was told you couldn't do that because apparently the British don't assassinate people. I'm not sure this is true, but he tells this story. And I tell you that to show that this is deeply contested. He talks very passionately about his quarrels with other members of the government because he felt it was Britain's responsibility to do something about Amin. And he thought our failure to do so was terrible and was negligent of our moral responsibilities. But not every politician would share his views. So these things are contested. So I would hesitate to say, you use the word apathy. I would hesitate to say there's apathy. I think there was complacency. You know, there were people who were kind of willing to stand back and be complacent. But I think they may still be a bit concerned by what was happening. And certainly as the death toll mounted in 1974, many, many more governments became really concerned about Amin. And after 74, the British government started behaving in a more constrained manner towards him because the violence, the figures were mounting and it was becoming quite difficult to deal with Uganda at all. So that's your first question. I think some of the revisionism that's going on, I mean, I mentioned Derek Peterson's work. As an American, I think Peterson is quite influenced by his experiences under Trump in the USA. And maybe some of this revisionism is partly a reaction to the kinds of things we are seeing under the Trump regime and the way in which that is being handled. So I think there are many different motivations for revisionism. Does it facilitate, I suppose I would say, does it kind of end up justifying the kinds of things that were done? I fear that maybe it does. Yeah, and I fear that some readers of this might take away a message that you wouldn't want them to take away, that this wasn't such a bad thing after all. And I do worry about that. And I therefore think that as historians and public intellectuals, we have a duty to challenge that view, even if we do have to use Jacques Derrida to do so. So I apologize for that, but thank you.
Here. Hi. Okay. Well, I'm really grateful for you to come and give us this space to discuss this theme, this really academic and intellectual theme. I was wondering at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about the political branches that they were, you said that there was that there was modernization and civilization. I was wondering, how do you interpret that kind of?
Thank you. That's a good question too. Many authoritarian regimes in Africa have managed to be quite modernizing. So if you look around the African continent at the moment, Rwanda, Ethiopia before the current war, Mozambique, these might all be countries that you would say had been successful in modernization recently, but they're all authoritarian, non-democratic governments. So there is some evidence, and it's supported by lots of political scientists, to argue that authoritarian governments in Africa are capable of modernization and economic growth. Now, those same analysts would go on to say, but at what cost? So what do you sacrifice to achieve that? So it's not that they're praising this overall, but they're saying, look, these governments do manage to get things done, albeit often by using fairly authoritarian and tyrannical methods. So that's all I really meant. I wasn't suggesting we should view them as progressives, for example, not at all. Modernization can be achieved without progress. Yeah. Thank you.
So you talk about the military experience of Idi Amin. He seemed like a very strategic, very cold-blooded man. So that's why it's very strange, the ethnic cleansing he made, towards Asian immigrants.
Ah,
That's why I want to ask you, do you think it was an irrational and unplanned move based full on hate, or it was part of a bigger discourse like we've seen in recent years?
thank you. This is great. That's a really good question too. So first thing to say is I grew up near the city of Leicester in England. From the age of 9, I was living there. And many of my very good friends are East African Asians who lived in Leicester. So Leicester became one of the centers for the immigrants that were thrown out of Uganda who came to the UK. So many of my personal friends are people who you're describing. So I feel quite passionate about this. So the first thing to say is that Amin is often blamed for the expulsions. But if you look at the history more closely, you will discover that Kenya began the expulsions a year earlier, and that they also started in Tanzania that year. And only then did Amin move to the expulsions. So the expulsions of Asians from East Africa were part of a broader picture. And Amin didn't inaugurate it. He simply joined it. And of course, then the way that he joined it, in his case, it became worse because Uganda did it in a different way and were much harsher about it and stole people's wealth. Most of the Asians leaving Kenya and leaving Tanzania were able to take their things with them. Many of those leaving Uganda took nothing but the shoes and clothes they stood in. So Amin changed the character of it, but he did not inaugurate it. Why did he do it? To steal the wealth. They simply plundered the Ugandan Asian wealth. And all those people I described as being in his cohort, that's how they got rewarded. They took things. Now, the government of Museveni in Uganda, he's recently tried to get Asians to come back, and he's tried to repay some of those debts that were lost in that story. But in the case of the Ugandan expulsions, that's where you see Amin's greed and avarice coming across. He is doing this for acute, what you would, if you were a Marxist, you might call it primitive accumulation, just stealing wealth from others. That's what he was doing.
Good afternoon, doctor. Thank you very much for your lecture. I want to ask, in your opinion, what shall be the primary point for the political sciences to study political violence?
So, sorry, I didn't understand the question. What can you ask again?
In your opinion,
what's the point of political violence? Well, how do I begin with that? So I suppose we label things as political violence because they're perpetrated in a particular way. And in Amin's case, the violence is conducted by state agencies. So we see it as having a political origin. But in what I described, I was trying to suggest that maybe all of it wasn't political, because I think some of the agents who are conducting it are carrying out violence for other reasons than the politics of the state. But the state initially is sanctioning this violence and is permitting it. And its principal targets are those who are seen as political opponents of the state. So that is why we label it that way. But there is a very large literature in political science about political violence, and not everyone would agree with what I've just said. So there's a lot you could read on this, and there are a lot of different definitions, and there in fact are 2 or 3 very good journals that publish work only on this. So it's quite an interesting field and very heavily researched. Lots of researchers working on this. Thank you.
One more question.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. My question is, to what extent can Idi Amin's dictatorship be understood as an historical continuation of colonial patterns of violence and authority established under British rule in Uganda?
Okay, the work I've been doing would push me towards that view. So the more I have looked at the colonial experience of Amin himself, the more I see connections. So I'm more inclined now to see a continuity than I was when I began the research. Now, if you look at other cases, would it be the same? So if you looked at other dictators, other tyrants who were violent, would they have a similar history? I'm not sure. I can think of one or two that would, but I can think of others that don't. So I don't think this is necessarily causation. I don't think we can say it's actually always the case. But in Amin's case, it appears that the configuration of factors propelled him in that direction. And it may be that my friend Ali Mazrui is right in saying that this would not have developed the way it did were Amin from a different place. So it may be that his origins are also something to do with some of this. So I'm a bit cautious, I suppose, in answering your question. Thank you.
I have a last question from the online.
Okay, yes, of course.
It's asking about this relationship with Amin with Israel, because he says that Amin support the Palestine independence process.
Eventually.
He also says that Yasser Arafat was the ally of Yasser Arafat, kidnapping on an airplane.
Yeah, to Kampala. Yeah.
He wants to remember that Amin has also his cultural and educative program that try to Africanize, make Swahili.
So Israel is friendly to Amin in the beginning, and then they have a big falling out. And Amin flips completely. So yes, you're quite right. It's a honeymoon that doesn't turn into a marriage. They don't consummate this marriage. They don't get along together. So Amin will become anti-Israel, and Israel will actually act against Amin in the second half of his regime. So yes, there is a big change. Should I remember Amin's attempt to promote African culture and Swahiliization? No. With all respect to the questioner, those were facile and opportune activities by Amin that amounted to almost nothing. They achieved very little, and they were done in order to placate certain kinds of external observer who Amin wished to impress. So they were done for reasons other than the apparent benefit of cultural development. I don't see anything under Amin's regime that was culturally advantageous in my judgment. Yeah.
Muchas gracias a todos y gracias por venir. Yes, it was quite interesting. Yeah. Yes. We were really interested.
Yeah, really good questions.
Yeah.
Oh.
Meeting just now. It was wonderful, very interesting. The whole authoritarianism, progress thing. Like the African American history would have told you that. It's just that liberal historians don't like to accept that progress